sense, refers to the Jesus of Nazareth as is reconstructed by historians using historical methods. And these historical methods make use of the critical analysis of gospel accounts, gospel texts, as well as non-biblical sources. You see, it's important in a study of this nature not to get caught up with emotionalism and rhetoric, to just simply say, well, my book says this, another person says my book says that. If, for example, someone were to tell you, or someone were to come to you and say that a certain individual was your father, and you were to question the legitimacy of that individual being your father, and the response you were to get was, well, that is a mystery, but somehow you have to believe it. And yet when you take that analogy, you find that missionaries, fundamentalists, Baptists, when they foist this Trinity, the Athanasian Creed, the belief in the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Ghost is God, but they are not three gods but one God, and expect you to believe it. And when you question them as to the basic premise in respect of this idea, they simply state, well, that is a mystery. You simply have to believe it. These two individuals, Hermann Samuel Reimarus and Baruch Spinoza, in fact the latter, Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher in the 16th century, he in fact raised the point when this was put forth to him, when they questioned him, God having to come down to earth as a man. And so he asked them, what do you mean? What are you trying to emphasize when you say God can come down to earth as a man? What are you trying to indicate or postulate? But Reimarus essentially provided this kind of analysis whereby he projected scholarly account, a scholarly analysis of the Gospels, and thereby came to a subsequently different conclusion in terms of which modern mainstream Christians have given to understand. And of course you look at his influence in the Tübingen school in Germany. One of the main characters, Albert Schweitzer, in fact he had come out with a book, the topic for tonight's talk, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, written in the early 1900s. And he questioned the premise in terms of which people had believed or had incorporated certain assumptions in respect of the nature of Jesus, in respect of the nature of religion on a broad level, based of course on their perceptions, based of course on what they see. That's why it's important that even us as Muslims need to not just simply be passive recipients, actively people telling us what to do. We need to have an active engagement with our text, maintain the interpretative relationship with the text of the Qur'an, operationalize its principles, and implement the mechanisms for the creation of a harmonious, broader social fabric which can aid and benefit humanity at large. Coming back to this particular individual, he, in a sense, developed at the outset three main mechanisms, methods to analyze historical sources. The first method, he stated, was what he called the criterion of dissimilarity. Now, might sound a bit of a technicality or academic, but effectively what it goes on to state is that any statements which are made, contrary to the author's agenda, are more likely to be reliable. In other words, if you find in a particular source certain verses, certain texts, and those texts or those particular chapters or verses go against the agenda of the particular author himself, then it's more likable that that particular text is reliable, because it means that the author, whoever has compiled the material, did not have an ulterior motive, an ulterior agenda. The other chapter is what we call the criteria of multiple attestation. What basically happens here is that when you have two or more sources, similar or consistent with each other, then it would stand to reason that at least certain part of that particular text, certain parts of that tradition would predate the source itself. One goes on, you look at the issue of the contextual and linguistic criteria. A source in itself is more credible when tradition when tradition makes sense in the context of what historians know about the cultural background. For example, if at a particular point in history there is like the language of the Setswana, you have certain idiosyncrasies, certain particular idioms, certain styles in terms of the manner in which you speak. That particular context or that style, the gist of it might in certain instances be known amongst your community. Similarly, when you have a text which dates from the 1st century, then it stands to reason that the best available understanding of the text was how was it understood at that point in time, at that juncture in particular in history. You then have what we call the author's agenda, certain instances where the author wishes to make certain narrations seem to narrate certain events and make them fulfill prophecy. And you find the same thing in the context of the Bible itself, the New Testament. Throughout the context of the New Testament, you find instances where certain particular chapters like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke are made to fulfill certain prophecy. And it gives the indication that Jesus somehow or the other fulfilled that prophecy. But in reality, it was something which was constructed at a later level, at a later time. And then you have what we call parallels in history and other mythologies. Now, this is something which is quite clearly interesting, because when you look at the history of Christianity, and certainly when you look at Jesus himself, you find that in the Gospels there are certain narrations of Jesus which can be found in accounts centuries before Jesus existed. For example, as we will come across it later, in Buddhism, for example, you would find certain passages, parallels in the life of Buddha. And you read the New Testament, you find exactly the same carbon copy, reproduction of what happened to Buddha. You find in other religions, such as the pagan religions of the sun gods, same parallels that would basically take place. And that begs a question, that if that is the case, is it not possible that the Jesus that we have today was nothing more than a reconstruction of those pagan myths, of idolatries, of different cultural accounts that had evolved in a particular point in history? Because one thing we need to know is that the Gospels, the New Testament, were written centuries after the demise of the particular writers. Matthew, for example, heard of the Gospel of Matthew? When was it written? In about 100 AD. John was written in about 110 AD, the oldest. Luke was written in about 75 AD. And Mark, which is the oldest, was written in the year 60 to 65 AD. Now, the problem is that all these so-called authors were dead at that particular point in time. So how does it make sense that these writings exist, but the so-called authors who were supposed to have written them died long before their particular time period? In fact, Mark, who is said to be the oldest gospel, Mark and Luke were not even the disciples of Jesus. Mark was a 10-year-old boy when Jesus upbraided his nation. Still, by the year 60 to 65 AD, he would have been dead. John, which was written about 110 AD, was one of the closest disciples of Jesus. Yet that book came into existence more than a century after the demise of Jesus and his disciples. So look at the sources. What we're having here is something which developed at a later point in time. They did not exist at the time of the events that allegedly occurred. Now, one of the arguments often raised, and this was something which we encountered in Port Elizabeth, in Cape Town, in other discussions, is that they state, well, you see, you Muslims, you tend to rely exclusively on the works and on the scholarship of so-called liberal scholars. We don't accept these particular sources. These sources, or these so-called biblical writers who have dated these particular gospel accounts, we don't accept them. But yet you find today in mainstream biblical scholarship, you look at people such as Bruce Metzger, you look at individuals like Hans Kung, the Catholic scholar, who was at one time a close associate of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the present Pope who's basically heading the Vatican today. And most of these particular scholars, in fact, even many mainstream Bibles, you check up the Bibles, you look at the Revised Standard Version, you look at the own English Standard Version, and the same particular detail will be coming across, that these particular books existed at a specific time. In fact, many people will tell you that they were only selected amongst many. They were selected in the 4th century at what we call the Council of Trent. I've got a book here called The Crucifixion of Truth. Interesting book, but there's a particular chapter here which has a list of books, no less than 200 books. This is just the first 2 pages, and you look at the further pages. No less than 200 books. And out of those 200 books, well, they decided these are what we are going to take. This is what we select. This is what we are happy with, because it conforms to our perceived beliefs, to our ideas, and so on. What about the Old Testament? And this is important when you look at the historical